What if the people hired to protect the wilderness were the ones who saw what no one was meant to see out in the vast dark of the forests when the last hiker has gone home and the campfires are nothing but dying embers? The world changes. Trees become silhouettes. The wind sounds like whispering voices, and every snap of a twig carries a question you do not want answered. Tonight's accounts come from those who patrol these places alone. The park ranger horror story that never makes it into official reports, the calls logged as wildlife activity or equipment malfunction. Some things they met out there were not animals, and once you hear what they've seen, you'll never look at a quiet forest the same way again. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. And subscribe to our channel for more horror stories that'll keep you up at night. Story 1. My name is Thomas Brennan, and I've been a park ranger for 18 years at the Cascade Mountain National Forest in Washington State. I manage trails, enforce regulations, conduct safety briefings, and deal with the occasional lost hiker or emergency situation. It's solitary work. I spend most of my time alone in the backcountry, maintaining equipment, marking trails, monitoring wildlife. I love this job. The quiet, the responsibility, the sense of being the steward of something vast and irreplaceable. But in the winter of 2008, I encountered something in these mountains that made me question whether I was protecting people from the wilderness or whether the wilderness was protecting itself from people. It started in October when a hiker went missing. His name was Robert Chen, age 42, from Seattle. He'd filled out a backcountry permit, standard procedure, indicating he was planning a 4-day solo hike in the northern section of the forest. He checked in at the ranger station with detailed information about his route. Start at Mirror, Lake Trailhead, summit Mount Reeves, loop back through Alpine Pass, finish at Lost Fork Creek. It was an ambitious route, but not unreasonable for an experienced hiker. Robert had hiked in the Cascades before. He had the right equipment. He knew the basics. He never checked out. On day 5 of his planned 4-day hike, when Robert hadn't returned, his wife called the ranger station. I was on duty. I immediately began protocols, checked his permit against actual summit records, confirmed his car was still in the trailhead parking lot, contacted search and rescue. The search took 5 days. We combed the marked trails with dogs, helicopters, ground teams. We checked the summit registry at Mount Reeves. No Robert Chen signature. We checked Alpine Pass. No sign of passage. We worked our way through the valley, calling his name, looking for equipment, checking known rest spots. On the 6th day, a search and rescue team found him. He was at the bottom of a ravine about 2 miles off trail, approximately 3 miles north of where he should have been. His body had been there for several days, partially decomposed. He was still wearing his backpack. His hiking boots were tied tightly. He hadn't taken them off. The medical examiner's preliminary assessment suggested he'd fallen. But the location was strange. The ravine he'd fallen into wasn't visible from any marked trail. You'd have to deliberately walk off trail, through dense forest, over rough terrain, to reach it. The question was, why had he gone off trail? I attended the briefing when SAR completed their report. The lead investigator, a woman named Patricia from the county sheriff's office, laid out the possibilities. 1. Robert had gotten disoriented and wandered off trail by mistake, become lost and fallen while trying to find his way back. 2. Robert had spotted something interesting, wildlife, an unusual rock, formation, something, and deviated to investigate, then had an accident. 3. Something else had happened. Like what? I asked. Patricia hesitated. Foul play, another person, a robbery or assault that ended with him going off the cliff. But there was no evidence of foul play. No signs of struggle, no indication of another person, no robbery. Robert's backpack still contained his wallet, phone, expensive camera equipment, nothing missing. I think he just got lost, Patricia concluded. Hikers wander off trail more often than people realize. They're following a stream, or thinking they see the trail continuing, or just not paying attention. Then they get disoriented. By the time they realize they're lost, they're stressed, not thinking clearly. They keep going in what they think is the right direction. Sometimes they fall. It made sense. I'd seen it before. People underestimating the wilderness, overestimating their own navigation skills. Robert had simply been another cautionary tale. But something bothered me about the location. The ravine where Robert was found was accessible only through incredibly dense forest. You couldn't stumble onto it by accident. And once you were in that ravine, the walls were steep, nearly sheer. If you fell, you'd fall hard. Robert's injuries were consistent with a high-impact fall. But why would he have been climbing around in a ravine? Winter hit hard that year. Snow came early, piled up thick, shut down most of the backcountry routes. I focused on maintaining the lower elevation trails, doing equipment checks, monitoring conditions for spring. Then, in December, another hiker went missing. This one was a woman named Susan Martinez, age 38, also doing a solo backcountry hike. Her route was different from Robert's. She was planning to hike the ridgeline trail, a lower elevation route that was supposed to be less challenging. She also never returned. Search and rescue conducted a similar operation. They found her 3 days later, about half a mile off the marked trail at the bottom of a different ravine. Same situation, body intact, backpack still with her, no signs of robbery or assault. Another accident, Patricia said when she briefed me. Same pattern as the other one. People underestimate the terrain. 2 accidents in the same forest, same type of outcome, 2 months apart? I asked. It happens, Patricia said. Wilderness doesn't discriminate, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the pattern. I started researching. I went through the ranger station archives, decades of records of missing hikers, accidents, fatalities. What I found was unsettling. Over the past 20 years, there had been 17 unexplained deaths in the Cascade National Forest. Not deaths that were clearly accidents, avalanches, falls on marked trails, exposure. But deaths where experienced hikers had gone off trail in ways that didn't make sense, had ended up in remote locations, and had fallen from heights into ravines or canyons. 17. Some were written off as accidents, some had become cold cases, but they all shared similarities. Hikers with permits, experienced enough to know better, suddenly deviating from their planned routes and ending up dead in places they couldn't reasonably have reached on purpose. I brought this to Patricia. I think there's a pattern, I said, laying out the data I'd compiled. Patricia studied it, her expression unreadable. Or, she said finally, you're seeing patterns because you want there to be a mystery. Occam's razor, Thomas. Most likely explanation is usually correct. Hikers make mistakes. Sometimes they die. But why would experienced hikers make mistakes that led them to ravines? Why not mistakes on the trail itself? I don't know, Patricia said, but I also don't have evidence of foul play. Without evidence, I can't investigate a crime. I decided to investigate it myself. I started spending extra time in the backcountry, specifically around the areas where the 17 victims had been found. I installed additional trail markers, ostensibly for safety, but really to document the exact locations. I started keeping detailed logs of the trails, the terrain, the wildlife patterns. And I started noticing things. In the areas where the bodies had been found, there were areas of disturbed earth, not recent. The disturbances were old, covered over with pine needles and moss. But if you knew what to look for, you could see evidence of movement, of human activity, repeated over time. There were also markers, subtle ones, easy to miss. Blazes on trees that didn't match the official trail system. Stones arranged in ways that could have been natural or could have been deliberate. A pattern of markers that, if you followed them, would lead you directly away from marked trails and toward the ravines. Someone had created a false trail system in the backcountry. A system designed to look natural, to be invisible to casual hikers, but to lead certain people who might be looking for an alternate route, people who might be following what appeared to be trail markers directly into danger. I reported this to Patricia immediately. Someone's creating fake trails, I said, leading hikers off the official routes, into ravines. It's not accidents, it's deliberate. Patricia listened, then asked the question I'd been dreading. Why would someone do that? I didn't have a good answer. I don't know. Maybe they're testing people. Maybe they have a vendetta against hikers. Maybe they're just cruel. Or, Patricia said quietly, maybe you're seeing patterns that aren't there. You're a park ranger, Thomas, not an investigator. You maintain trails. You don't investigate murders. Then have your investigators check it out, I said. Look at the false trail markers. Run forensics on the stones, the blazes, whatever. Find out if they're intentional. Patricia promised she would, but I never heard back. Over the next 2 years, there were 4 more deaths, all following the same pattern. Experienced hikers, deliberate deviation. From marked trails, fatal falls into ravines far from any official route. I kept documenting. I kept reporting. Patricia kept saying there was no evidence, no motive, no crime to investigate. Then, in 2010, a hiker survived. His name was David Marsh. He was hiking the Ridgeline Trail, the same route Susan Martinez had been on, when he noticed what he thought was an alternate route. He followed it for about a mile, then realized something was wrong. The path was too deliberate, too marked, but heading in the wrong direction. He stopped, turned around, and retraced his steps. When he got back to the marked trail, he contacted me directly. He said he thought someone was creating fake trails to mislead hikers. I brought David to Patricia. Finally, she listened. The investigation that followed was quiet, but thorough. Patricia brought in federal investigators, people from the Forest Service's Office of Special Investigations. They examined the fake trail markers, collected samples, ran analysis. They interviewed David extensively about the route, the markers, everything he'd observed. What they found was that the false trails had been in place for at least 15 years, possibly longer. The markers showed weathering consistent with long exposure. Some of the blazes were faded nearly to invisibility. Someone had been maintaining a system of false trails for over a decade. But who? The investigation went nowhere. Without a suspect, without motive, without direct evidence linking the false trails to specific deaths, investigators couldn't move forward. They couldn't even definitively prove that the false trails had caused the deaths. It was possible that the hikers had stumbled upon the false trails by accident and had made their own decisions to follow them. Patricia was frustrated. Without a perpetrator, she said, we can't prove a crime. We can't even definitively call it a crime. So the investigation stalled, then closed. The false trails were removed. Official trails were marked more prominently. Search and rescue protocols were updated, but there was never an arrest, never a resolution. I continued working as a park ranger, but everything had changed. Now, when I walked the back country, I looked for evidence of human activity, for signs that someone was still out there, still creating things. I found occasional markers that seemed wrong, but nothing definitive, nothing I could prove. In 2012, David Marsh, the hiker who'd survived, contacted me. He'd been thinking about what he'd experienced, and he'd reached a conclusion that terrified him. I don't think the trails were meant to kill people, he said. I think they were meant to select people, to separate people who would follow a false trail from people who wouldn't. Select them for what? I asked. I don't know, he said, but whoever was doing this, they weren't random. They were paying attention to hikers. They were watching, and they were creating a system to identify which ones would blindly follow a false path. I've thought about that theory for years now. Is it possible that someone was using the false trails as some kind of test, identifying hikers who were gullible, overconfident, or desperate enough to follow unmarked routes? And then, what, exploiting them somehow? I never got answers. I'm 56 now. I still work as a park ranger, though I'm planning to retire soon. I spend my days maintaining trails, monitoring the backcountry, keeping this place safe. But I've never stopped wondering about those 17 deaths. I've never stopped wondering if someone was deliberately creating that false trail system, and whether they're still out there, still watching, still testing hikers. Every time I find something wrong in the forest, a marker that seems out of place, a trail that's been recently disturbed, something that doesn't fit the pattern, I report it. And nothing ever comes of it. Sometimes I think about David Marsh's theory, about someone deliberately creating a system to identify and separate vulnerable hikers. And I think about how the wilderness doesn't reveal its secrets easily. How something could be happening in these mountains, could have been happening, for years, and no one would ever know because hikers don't come back to testify. If you ever hike in remote areas, here's what I've learned. Trust your instincts about trails. If something seems wrong, if the markers don't match official descriptions, if you have doubt, turn around. Don't be embarrassed about backtracking. Don't be proud about pressing forward. The wilderness will test you. And sometimes it's testing you for reasons you won't understand until it's too late. Stay on marked trails. Don't follow paths that seem convenient or clever. And if you see something that looks like it might be a false trail, rocks arranged, deliberately, blazes that don't match official markings, report it to a ranger. Because someone out there knows how to hide things in the forest, and they've been very good at it for a very long time. Story 2. My name is Coleman Mills, and I've been a park ranger for 20 years at Great Smoky Mountains National Park in Tennessee. I manage the eastern sector, about 80,000 acres of dense forest, switchback trails, waterfalls, and places. So remote that if something happens to you out there, it might be weeks before anyone even knows you're missing. I love this job. I love the solitude, the responsibility, the sense of being the guardian of something wild and essential. But in the spring of 2003, I discovered that guardianship sometimes means keeping secrets so dark that you can never fully speak them aloud. We had a problem that year that nobody wanted to acknowledge. Bodies. Not unusual in a national park. Hikers die from falls, heart attacks, getting lost in bad weather. But the bodies we were finding weren't in places where bodies should be. They were deep in the backcountry, in areas that didn't make sense as hiking. Destinations positioned in ways that suggested they'd been moved. The first one was discovered in April by a group of teenagers exploring off-trail. A skeletal remains in a ravine, partially buried, clothing decomposed to rags. We brought in forensics. Dental records identified him as Robert Kemp, reported missing 18 months earlier. He'd been hiking solo, permit in order, supposed to be on a marked trail. He'd never checked out. The coroner's report said blunt force trauma, likely from a fall, but the location, 3 miles off any trail, in a ravine so deep and remote that you'd have to deliberately climb down into it, made the fall theory seem unlikely. 2 weeks later, we found another one. This time it was a woman, skeletal as well, scattered across a rocky outcropping. Dental records identified her as Sarah Winters, missing for 2 years. Again, permit on file, marked trail, never checked out. Again, blunt force trauma. Again, location made no sense. My supervisor, a man named Richard Paulson who'd been running this sector for 15 years, called me into his office. "We need to be careful how we talk about this," he said quietly. "2 anomalies could be coincidence, but if word gets out that we're finding bodies in weird locations, it's going to spook visitors. People will stop coming. Tourism is this region's lifeblood." "So what are you suggesting?" I asked. "I'm suggesting we investigate thoroughly, but quietly," he said, "and we file reports that are technically accurate but not alarming." Over the next 3 months, we found 4 more bodies, all of them in locations that didn't match their reported trails, all of them showing similar trauma patterns, all of them missing for extended periods. One had been missing for 8 years. I started investigating on my own. I pulled every missing person report for the past 20 years. I cross-referenced with permits. I looked at the locations where bodies had been found versus where they were supposed to have been hiking. What I found was a pattern that made my skin crawl. The missing hikers fell into 2 categories. Category A, experienced hikers, proper permits, marked trails disappeared, and were never found. 23 cases over 20 years. Category B, inexperienced hikers, proper permits, marked trails, disappeared, and were found weeks or months later in remote ravines or on exposed ridges. 6 cases, all in the past year. The difference was that Category A bodies were never found. Category B bodies were found, and they showed trauma consistent with falls from heights. Someone was taking Category A people, experienced hikers, the ones who knew the park, the ones who wouldn't panic and make stupid mistakes, and they were disappearing them completely. And someone was taking Category B people, less experienced hikers, the ones who might make mistakes, the ones whose deaths could plausibly be blamed on accident, and they were positioning them where they'd be found, where the cause of death would be attributed to falls. It was a selection process. I brought my findings to Richard. "There's a pattern," I said, laying out the data. "People are being targeted. Category A disappears forever. Category B ends up dead in places with implausible fall scenarios." Richard studied the papers, his expression unreadable. "What are you suggesting?" he asked finally. "I'm suggesting someone is using the park as a hunting ground," I said. "Someone who knows the terrain. Someone who understands how to position bodies so they look accidental. Someone with access to permits, to park information, to—" "Stop," Richard said. He set down the papers carefully. "You're suggesting a park employee is involved?" "I'm suggesting someone with inside knowledge is involved." Richard was quiet for a long time. "Coleman," he said finally, "how long have you worked here?" 20 years. "And in that time, have you ever found evidence of a crime? I mean real evidence, not patterns and theories." "The bodies are evidence," I said. "The bodies are bodies," he replied. "We have plausible explanations for all of them. Falls happen. People get lost. The wilderness is dangerous. You take those 6 Category B cases to a prosecutor, and they tell you to come back when you have something that proves foul play. What about Category A? I asked. 23 people who vanished and were never found? People go missing in national parks, Richard said. It happens. Most of them end up dead in places we never search, decomposed beyond recovery. It's tragic, but it's not conspiracy. I felt frustration rising. You're not even curious? Richard leaned back in his chair. I'm very curious, he said. And if I investigate, if I make accusations, if I suggest that someone at this park is involved in disappearances, do you know what happens? The park gets scrutinized, media shows up, lawsuits get filed, visitor numbers drop, budgets get cut. This station might close. So we just ignore it? I asked. We document it, Richard said. We file reports. We do our job as rangers. But we don't go looking for monsters, Coleman. Because if we find them, we become responsible for what they do next. That conversation shifted something in me. I started looking at my colleagues differently. Who had access to permits? Who knew the terrain well enough to position bodies in remote locations? Who had the authority to file reports that might be incomplete? Who had been here long enough to know which areas weren't thoroughly patrolled? I started noticing things. There was a seasonal ranger named Dale Hutchins, early 40s, had been working seasonal positions at various parks for 15 years. He was quiet, efficient, always willing to take the hard trails, the remote patrols. He knew the park's unmaintained roads better than anyone. He had a slight limp, old injury, he said, from a climbing accident years ago. I started tracking his schedule. When Category B bodies were found, I looked back at the incident reports. Dale had been the first responder on 3 of the 6. He'd been out on patrol when the bodies were discovered. Coincidence, maybe. Or maybe not. I started following him. On a Saturday in July, Dale took a patrol car and drove to a remote section of the park, an old access road that wasn't officially maintained. I followed at a distance, parking my vehicle a quarter mile back and hiking through the forest. I found him at a clearing I'd never known existed, a quarter mile off. Any marked trail, completely invisible, unless you knew where to look. He had a spade. He was digging. My hand went to my radio, then stopped. What was I going to report? A ranger digging in the woods? That wasn't evidence of anything. I moved closer, carefully, staying behind the tree line. The hole he was digging was roughly 6 feet long, maybe 3 feet deep. He worked steadily, mechanically, sweat on his shirt despite the cool temperature. Then I saw it, a small tent, deep green, packed down and nearly invisible behind a stand of rhododendrons. Camping equipment, a cooler, a journal. Dale stopped digging and sat down heavily on a nearby log. He looked exhausted, broken, almost. He pulled out a cigarette, lit it with shaking hands, and smoked while staring at the hole he'd been making. I should have called for backup. I should have radioed Richard. I should have followed procedure. Instead, I stepped out from behind the trees. Coleman, he said, not surprised, like he'd been waiting for this. Wondered how long it'd take you to figure it out. My hand was on my belt, near where my service weapon hung. What are you doing? I asked. Job, he said quietly. Someone's got to do it. What job? Dale gestured at the hole, at the equipment, at the whole scene. Selection, he said. The park takes people, has for 100 years, but it's random, wasteful. People dying from accidents, from bad luck, from being stupid. I'm just organizing it. My mouth went dry. You killed those people. I positioned opportunities, Dale said. People who ignored warnings, who went off trail, who thought they knew better than the wilderness. I gave them a chance to prove themselves, and when they couldn't, he shrugged. You're insane, I said. Maybe, he said. Or maybe I'm just doing what everyone else is too civilized to admit. The park needs to thin itself, needs to cull the weak, the careless, the ones who don't respect it. I'm just the instrument. How many? I asked. Dale looked away. Does it matter? How many? Enough, he said. Enough that the park feels it. Enough that the ones who come here learn to be careful. Enough that the wilderness stays wild. I radioed for backup, but by the time Richard and the state police arrived, Dale was gone. They found the camping equipment, the journal, which contained nothing but sketches and coordinates, the hole he'd been digging. But Dale had disappeared into the forest, and despite search efforts, we never found him. He never came back to work. His apartment had been cleared out. His truck was parked at a different trailhead, keys on the seat. All we have is the certainty that he was involved and the absolute lack of evidence that would satisfy a court. Richard retired 6 months after that. The park district brought in new leadership, quieter investigations, reports filed and then filed away. The narrative settled into something manageable, a few tragic accidents, a disturbed, seasonal worker who'd quit without notice, nothing systemic, nothing to worry about. But the bodies kept appearing, not as frequently as before, but regularly enough, and each one was positioned in a location that didn't make sense, with trauma that implied a fall, but in a place where a fall seemed unlikely. Someone was still doing the work Dale had started. Maybe it was Dale himself, from a distance. Maybe it was someone else who'd picked up the practice. Or maybe, and this is what I've come to believe, the park itself had developed an appetite, and people like Dale were just the conscious expression of something that didn't need consciousness to do what it does. I'm still working here. I've been transferred to different sectors, different responsibilities, but I never left. What I've learned is that some places have their own logic. Some places have their own purposes, and some places are content to let people die, as long as the paperwork makes sense. If you ever hike in Great Smoky Mountains or any major park, here's what I want you to know. Stay on marked trails, not because the rangers are protecting you, but because the wilderness is indifferent to your safety. Stay on the marked trails because that's the only place where the rules are clear. If you see someone, a ranger, a hiker, anyone, suggesting a shortcut, recommending an unmaintained trail, encouraging you to go just a little bit further off the path, don't. Trust your gut. The wilderness doesn't offer help that doesn't serve its own purposes. And if you get lost, if you go off trail and realize your mistake, don't keep walking. Sit down, stay visible, wait for rescue. Don't walk toward where you think you should be, because sometimes the wilderness guides you exactly where it wants you to go. I don't know if Dale Hutchins is still alive. I don't know if he's still in these mountains. I don't know if he was ever actually the one doing the work, or if he was just the voice a predatory place gave itself for a brief moment. What I know is that people still go missing, bodies still appear in places they shouldn't be, and every season, new Category B cases develop into incidents that get filed and forgotten. The park takes what it needs, and we rangers just try to manage the paperwork so no one has to think too hard about what's really happening out there in the dark. Story 3. My name is Elias Vance, and I've been a ranger at North Cascades National Park for 12 years. Most people think the scariest part of my job is a bear or a cougar. They're wrong. The scariest part is finding something man-made where no man should have been. This happened in the winter of 2018. The park closes most of its high-elevation roads by November, meaning the backcountry becomes deep wilderness until spring thaw. My job during those months is patrol, skiing or snowshoeing into remote cabins to check structural integrity, monitoring snowpack, making sure no one is illegally camping. It's solitary work, just me, the wind, and miles of white silence. In early December, a heavy storm system dumped 4 feet of snow in 3 days. Once it cleared, I was sent to check on the Copper Ridge Lookout, a fire tower that sits at 6,000 feet. It's miles from the nearest road. In winter, it's effectively on the moon. I skied in, taking 2 days. The world was perfect, untouched white, no tracks, no sound, just the scrape of my skis and my own breathing. When I reached the ridge, I saw the tower. It was encased in ice, rime frost clinging to the railings like frozen lace. I unlocked the lower door, dug out the steps, and climbed up to the main cabin. Inside, everything was as it should be, cold, dusty, secure. I checked the logbook, noted the temperature, checked the windows. Then I saw something on the floor. It was a small red plastic object. I picked it up. It was a Lego brick, a single bright red 2x4 Lego brick. I stared at it. The tower hadn't been opened since October. The last ranger to visit was a guy named Miller, who didn't have kids and definitely didn't play with Legos. Before that, it was just summer staff. We sweep these places clean. I put it in my pocket, figured maybe a mouse had dragged it from some forgotten crack. I spent the night in the tower. The wind howled like a jet engine. The next morning, I packed up to ski down to the next cabin, a shelter near the Chilliwack River. It's a long descent, steep and technical. Halfway down, in a dense stand of hemlock trees miles from any trail, I saw something bright against the snow. I skied over. It was a snowman, Not a rough collection of snowballs. A perfectly sculpted, anatomically detailed figure of a child, maybe 3 feet tall. It had arms made of ice, fingers individually carved. It had a face that wasn't smiling. It looked terrified. The mouth was open in a silent scream, and around its neck was a scarf. A real red wool scarf. I touched it. The wool was dry. It hadn't snowed since the storm ended 2 days ago. This scarf had been put here recently. I looked around. The snow around the figure was pristine. No ski tracks, no snowshoe prints, no boot holes, just smooth, unbroken powder for 50 yards in every direction. I circled the area, widening my loops. Nothing. It was as if the figure had simply appeared, or been dropped from the sky. A cold that had nothing to do with the temperature slid down my spine. I took a photo with my radio unit. We didn't carry smartphones on deep patrol. Then, marked the GPS coordinates, and skied fast toward the river shelter. When I got to the shelter, the door was unlatched. It swung open with a groan. I pulled my bear spray, holding it ready. "Ranger service," I yelled. "Anyone inside?" Silence. I stepped in. The shelter was empty. But on the wooden table in the center of the room, someone had set a place for dinner. A plastic plate, a plastic cup, a plastic fork, and in the center of the plate, a single frozen pine cone. Next to it was a sheet of paper, a page torn from a children's coloring book. It had been colored in with crayons, messy, frantic scribbles of black and red. I checked the perimeter. Again, no tracks leading to the cabin. The snow on the roof was undisturbed. The snow at the door was packed down only by my own skis. I radioed dispatch. "Base, this is Vance. I've got signs of intrusion at Chilliwack Shelter. No subject visible, no tracks." "Copy, Vance. Say again." "No tracks." "Affirmative. It looks like, I don't know, like someone just materialized inside." "Copy. Stay secure. Do not engage if you see anyone. Weather is turning again. You might be stuck there." I barricaded the door that night. I didn't sleep. Every creak of the wood sounded like footsteps. Every gust of wind sounded like a voice. At 3 a.m. I heard giggling. It was distinct, a child's giggle, coming from right outside the wall near my head. I froze. "Hello?" I whispered. The giggling stopped. Then a small hand slapped the outside wall. Whap, then again, whap. Then a scratching sound, like fingernails on rough wood. I grabbed my ice axe and the bear spray. I stood by the door, heart hammering against my ribs. "This is the Park Service," I shouted. "Identify yourself." Silence. Then a voice, adult, deep, calm, spoke from the exact same spot. "He's cold, Elias. Let him in." It knew my name. I backed away to the far corner of the cabin. I kept my light trained on the door. "I have a weapon," I said. "I have backup coming." A lie. "Backup can't reach you," the voice said. "The snow is too deep. Just open the door. We want to play." I didn't open the door. I sat in that corner for 5 hours until the sun came up. The voice didn't speak again. The scratching stopped after an hour. When morning broke, I burst out of the cabin, ready to fight. The snow around the cabin was empty. Completely empty. No footprints, no handprints on the wall where the slapping had been, no disturbance in the drifts. I skied out of there faster than I've ever skied in my life. I didn't care about safety protocols. I didn't care about avalanche risks. I just wanted out. When I got back to the trailhead and met the extraction team, I was shaking so bad I couldn't unbuckle my boots. I told them everything. They sent a team back up 2 days later. They found the snowman. It had melted slightly, losing its definition, but the red scarf was still there. They found the place setting in the cabin, but here's the part that made me transfer to a desk job in administration. They ran the DNA from the scarf. It matched a boy named Toby Miller. Toby Miller went missing in the park in 1998. 20 years ago, he was 6 years old. He vanished from a campground in July. He was wearing a red t-shirt, not a scarf. But the coloring book page? They found the book it came from in a box of evidence from the original search. It had been in Toby's backpack, which was found near the river back in '98. The page I found had been torn out after the book was recovered by police, which means someone had access to evidence, or someone had taken that page 20 years ago and kept it. And the voice? When I listened to the dispatch tapes of the search from 1998, there was a recording of a radio transmission that had been dismissed as interference. a deep, calm voice cutting through the static. "He's cold. We're keeping him." It was the same voice. "I don't go into the backcountry in winter anymore. I don't ski. I don't look at snowmen, because I know that whatever is out there doesn't leave tracks, and it has a very long memory, and it likes to play." Story 4. My name is Marcus Sheffield, and I worked as a ranger in the Cascade Range for 14 years before I quit. I quit because I found something in the mountains that made me understand that some places have their own consciousness, and it doesn't care about your permit or your safety briefing. This happened in the summer of 2006, during what should have been a routine patrol. I was checking high alpine lakes for invasive species, part of an ongoing program to keep certain watersheds clean. I had a list of 8 lakes, each accessible by different routes. Most were manageable day trips if you started early. The 5th lake on my list was one I'd never actually visited, though I'd worked in that sector for 5 years. It was called Mirror Peak Lake, according to the old maps, though I'd never seen it mentioned in recent reports or visitor logs. The trailhead was marked, but barely maintained. The trail itself was overgrown, suggesting minimal use, but the map showed it was only about 2 miles in, maybe 1,000 feet elevation gain. I decided to check it out. The hike took longer than expected. The trail kept forking in ways the map didn't show. Twice I had to backtrack. The forest got progressively darker, taller trees, denser canopy, less light reaching the ground. It was like descending into something rather than climbing. After 3 hours, I reached the lake. It was perfect. Mirror flat water, high granite walls reflected in the surface so completely that the water looked like an extension of the sky. Haunting and beautiful and absolutely silent. I pulled out my sampling equipment and started collecting water. Standard protocol: fill bottles, test for pH and temperature, note any visible algae or contaminants, document wildlife signs. While I was working, I noticed something across the lake, a structure of some kind, partially hidden by an overhang of rock. It looked like a shelter, not a modern one. Something older, built from stone and wood, deliberately positioned to be invisible from most angles. I hiked around the lake to investigate. The shelter was maybe 10 feet across, built into a natural alcove in the cliff face. The entrance was narrow, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Inside, the space opened up slightly, maybe 8 feet of usable depth. Someone had been living here. Not recently. There was dust, old pine needles, moss growing on the stone floor. But the shelter showed signs of intentional use. A fire pit in the center, stones, arranged as a sleeping area, branches woven together as some kind of framework. There was also a journal, a leather-bound book, weathered and warped, sitting on a flat rock like a manuscript in a museum. I opened it. The handwriting was precise, almost architectural. The first entry was dated July 1998, 8 years ago. I found what they've been looking for, the place between, the lake that remembers. I can feel it watching. I can feel all of them watching. They come to this place. They've always come to this place, and they don't leave the same way they arrived. The entries continued, day after day, sometimes multiple times a day. The author was meticulous, documenting observations. Saw 3 hikers today. They didn't see me. They walked to the edge of the water and stared at it for 30 minutes without speaking. Then they turned and walked back down the trail. Different hikers would have stayed, would have swum, would have explored. These 3 had been changed by something. Another entry, found a boot, just one, woman size 7, relatively new. No body, no blood, just the boot, positioned at the water's edge like it was placed deliberately. Where do they go? Do they walk into the water? Do they fly? I understand now. The lake doesn't kill people, it translates them, moves them into somewhere else, a version of somewhere else. And what we find, the boots, the scattered belongings, the confused hikers who make it back out, those are just remnants. The real people are still here, living parallel lives we can't perceive. The final entry was dated 3 weeks ago. I'm ready. I'm going to walk into the water tonight. I'm going to see what's on the other side. I'm going to find all of them. I'm going to... The writing stopped mid-sentence. I radioed the station immediately. When my supervisor, a woman named Patricia, heard about the journal, she got quiet. "What's the author's name?" she asked. I paged back through the journal. The name appeared on the inside cover, written in faded ink. "David Chen," I said. Patricia's voice changed. "Come back to the station. Now." I hiked out fast, covering the 3 miles in less than 90 minutes. When I arrived, Patricia was waiting with a file. David Chen worked for the Park Service in 1998, she said. He was a volunteer ranger for one summer. He disappeared. She showed me a photograph. A young man, early 20s, with intelligent eyes and a careful expression. It was the same face I'd seen in the journal, same handwriting. He went missing in August 1998, Patricia continued. We searched for weeks. No body, no sign of him. It was assumed he'd gotten lost, or had an accident, or had simply decided to leave. He had a history of depression. Did anyone find any trace of him? I asked. No, Patricia said. Not a trace. Until you found that journal. I showed her the entries. Her expression grew more unsettled as she read. This is disturbing, she said finally. But it doesn't prove anything concrete. The journal reads like the work of someone in crisis. He may have been suicidal. He may have written this after deciding to leave the park. Or, I said carefully, something happened to him at that lake. Patricia set down the journal. What kind of something? I don't know, I admitted, but the pattern he documented, hikers acting strange, objects being left behind, people disappearing, that suggests something systematically unusual about that location. Patricia was quiet for a moment. I need to show this to the park director, she said. We might need to close that area. What happened next moved slowly, then very fast. The park director authorized a more thorough investigation. We sent a team to the lake, myself, Patricia, a geologist, and a psychologist, who worked with the Park Service on unusual situations. The geologist tested the water. It was normal, slightly acidic, within expected parameters for an alpine lake, no unusual minerals or contaminants. The psychologist reviewed the journal. She concluded it was consistent with someone experiencing a severe mental health crisis, possible psychosis, possible suicidal ideation, but that the writing showed evidence of deliberate documentation, which suggested David had periods of clarity. Whether his observations are real or delusional is difficult to determine, she said, but clearly something was happening in his mind. Whether it corresponded to external reality is another question. But then I found the other journals. There were 4 more, hidden in different locations around the lake, under rocks, wedged into cracks in the cliff face, buried in cairns of stones. They were dated going back to 1987, written in different hands, documenting similar experiences. The lake takes you if you let it. I can feel myself changing, my edges getting soft. Soon I'll be ready. Soon I'll step into the water and become something else, something that belongs here. This is the place between sleeping and waking, the place where the park keeps its deepest things. I found others like me here. We sit by the water sometimes, we don't talk, we just exist. And we wait. If anyone finds this, don't come to the lake. Don't let the lake see you. It remembers everyone who arrives. It keeps us. Not alive, not dead, just kept. The park director faced a choice. Option A was to publicize the findings, close the area, treat it as an archaeological or psychological mystery that would draw intense media attention and tourism. Option B was to quietly remove the journals, seal the location, and prevent access without explanation. The director chose B. The area around Mirror Peak Lake was officially designated as closed due to unstable geology. No hikers permitted, no access. A ranger was supposed to check the trailhead monthly to ensure the barrier remained in place. I was assigned that duty. Over the next 4 years, I monitored that location carefully. The barrier we installed, a chain across the trailhead with a closed sign, was repeatedly removed. Not by hikers, there were no boot prints suggesting unauthorized access. But regularly, consistently, the chain would be gone and the sign would be missing. We'd replace it. It would disappear again. Once, I followed the chain to see where it had been dragged. It led deep into the forest, away from any trail, arranged in a pattern that looked almost deliberate, a line leading toward the lake, then looping back toward the trailhead. I also started documenting other incidents. Hikers reporting getting lost on marked trails near the lake, despite following their GPS and map carefully. Hikers describing a voice that seemed to come from the water, calling them toward it. Hikers describing finding equipment they didn't recognize, boots, a jacket, a watch, positioned at specific points on the trail. All of it clustering around that one location. In 2010, a group of 4 college students somehow bypassed the barrier, we never figured out how, and hiked to the lake. Only 3 came back. The missing student's name was Emily. Her hiking buddies said she'd walked to the edge of the water to get a better look, and when they called her back to the group, she didn't respond. They hiked around the lake looking for her. She was gone. We organized a search. We found her boot, positioned at the water's edge, just like David Chen had documented years earlier. We never found Emily. That was when I quit. Not because I was afraid, though I was, but because I realized the Park Service wasn't going to do anything about it. They were going to keep the area closed, keep collecting incidents, keep finding single boots and abandoned equipment, and they weren't going to tell anyone why. And I couldn't live with that. I've spent 14 years trying to understand what's happening at Mirror Peak Lake. My best theory, it's a place where the boundary between our world and somewhere else is worn thin. Not metaphorically, physically thin, and something or someone on the other side is aware of us, curious about us. David Chen's journal suggests he believed the lake was translating people, moving them into parallel versions of existence. The objects we find, boots, watches, jewelry, might be the material anchors left behind when a person is translated. Or maybe the lake is just a predator. A geological feature that has learned to lure humans and process them in ways we don't have words for. I don't know. What I know is that Mirror Peak Lake is closed. It's been closed for over a decade, and somewhere in the Park Service, there's a file documenting the missing people, the journals, the patterns, and nobody is doing anything about it. If you ever see a warning sign that a park area is closed due to unstable geology, and that sign seems permanent, and the reason seems vague, consider that there might be a reason the Park Service doesn't want to explain. Some places aren't closed for geological reasons. Some places are closed because they're hungry, and feeding them is easier than fighting them. Story 5. My name is Warren Pickford, and I spent 16 years as a ranger in the Wallowa Mountains of Eastern Oregon. 16 years of clearing trails, issuing permits, and conducting rescues. 16 years of believing that my job was to protect people from the wilderness. Then I realized the wilderness didn't need my help to be dangerous. It had its own system, its own predators, and some of them wore ranger uniforms. This started in late September 2011 when a hiker filed a formal complaint against one of our seasonal rangers. The hiker's name was Susan, and she said the ranger, a man named Douglas Harrell, had deliberately given her false directions that sent her miles off trail into terrain so difficult she'd barely escaped with her life. Douglas had worked for us for 3 seasons. He was quiet, efficient, always volunteered for the remote patrols. I'd worked with him a dozen times. He seemed fine, professional, competent. But Susan's complaint was specific. She'd asked for directions to Eagle Lake. Douglas had pointed her toward what he said was the main trail. She'd followed his instructions and ended up in a technical rock scramble that nearly killed her. When she made it back down and confronted him, he apologized, said he'd given her bad information, offered to file an incident report. He never filed anything. I started digging into Douglas's employment history. What I found was unsettling. In the 2 seasons before he'd worked for us, Douglas had been a ranger at 3 different parks across the Pacific Northwest. At each location, he'd quit or been let go within a single season. I contacted those parks. The supervisors were cagey. Nobody wanted to officially state that Douglas had done anything wrong. But they all had similar stories. Hikers getting lost after taking Douglas's directions, hikers reporting that Douglas had warned them not to take certain trails, hikers claiming Douglas had actually escorted them off trail and then forgotten where he'd left them. One supervisor from a park in Washington mentioned something that made my gut tighten. "We think he was testing people," she said, like he was seeing who would follow his directions blindly and who would question him. "We think he was cataloging people." I brought all of this to my supervisor, the district manager. His response was predictable. "What's your actual evidence?" "We have 1 complaint from 1 hiker. We have hearsay from other parks. We have nothing concrete." "Isn't the pattern enough?" I asked. "Pattern isn't proof," he said. "And if we fire someone based on suspicion, we open ourselves to lawsuits, so we did nothing." But I started monitoring Douglas. I reviewed the incident reports from his patrols. I looked at where he'd been when hikers reported getting lost, and I started seeing something horrifying. There were clusters, areas where Douglas had been patrolling when multiple hikers got disoriented, in the same general region over the course of a season. Areas that weren't particularly difficult terrain, places where a lost Hikers should have been able to self-recover relatively easily, but they weren't recovering easily. They were staying lost longer than made sense. Some of them were turning up in ravines, claiming they'd gotten confused about directions. Some of them were reporting hearing a voice that sounded like a ranger giving instructions deeper into the backcountry. In October, a college student named Marcus went missing after a hike. His parents had dropped him off at the trailhead for what was supposed to be a day hike to a popular waterfall. He never came back. Search and rescue found his body 3 days later in a ravine 2 miles off. Any trail, dead from blunt force trauma consistent with a fall from height. The report said he'd gotten lost, followed the wrong stream, ended up in terrain he couldn't navigate, and had fallen in the darkness. What the report didn't mention was that Marcus had left his phone on, and the last location data pinged a spot that was directly on a ranger patrol route. And the last text he'd sent to his roommate was a screenshot of directions. Directions that didn't match any marked trail in the park. The directions had been photographed from a piece of paper. The handwriting was Douglas Harrell's. I brought this to the district manager. I said I thought Douglas was deliberately directing hikers into dangerous terrain, possibly causing falls or ensuring that people already in difficult situations stayed lost. Do you have proof he intended harm? The manager asked. He deliberately gave false directions, I said. He gave directions, the manager said. False directions aren't necessarily intent to harm. They could be mistakes, miscommunication. You're suggesting something conspiratorial without evidence. Then let me follow him, I said. Let me observe his patrols. Let me document what he's actually doing out there. The manager refused, said it would constitute harassment of an employee. Said we needed to follow HR protocols, said we needed to be careful. So I did it anyway, unofficially. I started timing my patrols to overlap with Douglas's. I'd hang back, out of sight, and followed him through the backcountry. What I saw made my skin crawl. Douglas would station himself at trail junctions and wait. When hikers approached, he'd introduce himself as a ranger. He'd ask them where they were headed, and then he'd give them directions that were subtly, almost imperceptibly wrong. Just enough that after a mile or so, the hikers would realize something was off, but by then, they'd be committed to the direction, convinced that they'd misunderstood, rather than that the ranger had lied. I watched him do it to at least a dozen hikers over the course of 3 weeks. Some of them figured it out quickly and came back, but others, particularly the ones hiking alone, the ones who seemed less confident, the ones who seemed like they'd be prone to panic, those ones Douglas seemed to take special interest in. I watched him stand at a trail junction with a solo female hiker, explaining in a calm, authoritative voice why she should take a fork that didn't appear on the official map. I watched him walk the first 100 yards with her before peeling off, acting like he had other duties. I followed her. She stayed on his suggested path for nearly a mile before realizing something was wrong. By then, she was in terrain that was difficult to navigate. She spent 3 hours trying to get back to the main trail. By the time she made it, she was exhausted, dehydrated, and terrified. I approached her when she reached the trailhead. "Did a ranger give you directions today?" I asked. She looked at me with haunted eyes. "Yeah. He said I should take the left fork. He seemed really sure about it." "Did he seem familiar with that area?" "He was wearing a uniform," she said. "Why would he lie to me?" I didn't have an answer that made sense. I went straight to the district manager and told him I'd witnessed Douglas deliberately misdirecting hikers. "Did he tell them to go into dangerous terrain?" the manager asked. "He told them to take wrong trails," I said. "He knew they were wrong. Did he intend for them to be harmed?" "I don't know his intent," I said, "but the effect is the same. He's putting people in dangerous situations." The manager was quiet for a long time. Then he said something I'll never forget. "Warren, we have a legal department. They've advised me that if Douglas believed the directions he gave were correct, even if they weren't, then we have no grounds for termination. And if we fire him based on your personal observation that he deliberately misdirected people, Douglas will sue us for wrongful termination, and he'll probably win." "So we just let him keep doing it?" I asked. "We monitor the situation," the manager said. "We document incidents. We ensure that if something concrete happens, we have records. But we don't act based on suspicion alone." I quit 2 weeks later. Not dramatically. I just turned in my resignation, cited personal reasons, and walked away. What I know now is that Douglas is probably still out there somewhere, working as a ranger at another park, using a different method or the same method with slight variations, still testing people, still cataloging them, still occasionally ensuring that the ones who fit a specific profile, the vulnerable ones, the ones hiking alone, the ones prone to panic, end up in situations where they're likely to die. And the Park Service knows about him, or at least knows about people like him, and they do nothing because addressing it would be inconvenient. If you ever get directions from a ranger, verify them. Check your map. Don't trust authority just because of a uniform, and if a ranger's directions seem off, trust that instinct, because some people who work in the wilderness aren't there to protect it, or to protect you. They're there because they've figured out that remote places are perfect for doing things that don't need to be reported, and the system that employs them is too bureaucratic, too cautious, too afraid of lawsuits to stop them. Story 6. My name is Alice Proctor, and I've been a wilderness ranger in the Boundary Waters Canoe area of northern Minnesota for 19 years. 19 years of managing portages, monitoring campsites, and conducting water rescues across a landscape of 10,000 lakes connected by ancient paddling routes. 19 years of believing I understood this place. In the summer of 2008, I learned that understanding a place and knowing what happens in it are two completely different things. It started with a logbook. Every established campsite in the Boundary Waters has a weatherproof box with a logbook where paddlers can write their names, dates, and comments. It's a tradition that goes back decades. Most entries are mundane: beautiful sunset, saw a moose, great fishing. Some are poetry or sketches. Occasionally we get complaints or reports of damage. But the logbook at Clearwater Lake, a remote site accessible only by a specific portage sequence, had something different. The entries started in 1994. I know this because I was the one who replaced that logbook after it filled up, and I scanned the pages before archiving them. What I found was a parallel narrative running through 16 years of casual tourist comments. Scattered throughout were entries in the same handwriting, precise, clinical, written in blue ink, that didn't match the pattern of other visitors. These entries never identified the author. They were observations. Third solo paddler this week. Nervous type. Stopped multiple times to check the map even though the portage is well marked. Turned back at the halfway point. Predictable? Pair of women, both athletic, both confident. One kept trying to paddle faster than the current. The other was cautious. Only the cautious one would survive if something happened. Natural selection in real time. Family of 4, children approximately ages 6 and 9. The father is distracted. The mother is competent but tired. The balance is fragile. These entries appeared every few days during summer months, mixed in with normal tourist comments. And they were always followed, weeks or months later, by another entry, incident reported. Canoe overturned on portage trail. 1 casualty. Expected outcome. I showed these entries to my supervisor, Richard. His face went pale as he read them. "When did you find these?" he asked. "They're in the archived logbook," I said. "The one we replaced this summer. 16 years of entries mixed in with regular visitor comments." Richard pulled up incident reports on his computer. What we found was horrifying. There had been 17 drowning deaths or portage accidents in the Boundary Waters over the past 16 years, significantly higher than the regional average for wilderness areas of similar size and usage. Most had been attributed to human error, overloaded canoes, lack of proper flotation, poor paddling skills, underestimation of conditions. But every single death corresponded to an entry in that logbook. Not just corresponded, they matched the descriptions. A nervous solo paddler, a family with a distracted father, 2 women, 1 athletic, and 1 cautious. Someone had been documenting people before they died, describing them like specimens, predicting their vulnerabilities, and then those people had accidents. "This could be a serial killer," Richard said quietly. "Someone who's been using this location to identify victims. Or," I said, "someone who's been predicting accidents that happen anyway." 17 times, Richard asked. "Accurately predicting how people will die before it happens?" We reported it to the state authorities. What happened next was a masterclass in bureaucratic inaction. The state police took the logbook as evidence. They analyzed the handwriting. They compared it to park employees. They searched for any historical records of someone living in or near the Boundary Waters long term. Nothing. No matches, no suspects, no evidence of an actual crime beyond a logbook containing predictions that had come true. Without a suspect or definitive proof of intent to harm, the police concluded that the logbook entries were the work of someone with an obsessive personality who was coincidentally predicting deaths that would have happened anyway. A self-fulfilling prophecy, one officer suggested. The person writes down a scenario, and because thousands of people paddle through here every year, eventually a scenario matching that description occurs. 17 times? I asked. Statistically possible, the officer said, especially if the observer is specifically noting vulnerable-seeming people and predicting bad outcomes. So the investigation went nowhere, but the entries didn't stop. The new logbook we placed at Clearwater Lake began accumulating the same type of entries. The same precise handwriting, the same clinical observations, the same predictions. And the incidents kept happening. I started cross-referencing. Every entry in the logbook that predicted an incident was followed, within days or weeks, by an actual drowning or accident at a different location in the boundary waters. Someone was moving around the wilderness, observing paddlers, predicting their deaths, and then those deaths were occurring. I started interviewing survivors, people who'd had accidents but lived. And I noticed a pattern. Almost all of them reported seeing a ranger somewhere on or near their canoe route. A ranger who'd warned them about conditions or asked where they were headed, or had simply observed them. But when I checked official records, no ranger had been on duty in those areas. I started investigating which ranger stations were most frequently mentioned. One name came up repeatedly, a seasonal ranger named Joseph Whitmore who'd been working in different regions of the boundary waters for the past 4 years. I pulled Joseph's employment file. He was in his early 50s, had worked at multiple parks across the country in seasonal positions. He always quit or left after one season. He had no significant incidents on record, no complaints, no red flags. I requested to shadow one of his patrols. Richard was reluctant. "You're suggesting a park employee is predicting murders," he said. "That's a serious accusation." "Not murders," I said. "I'm suggesting he's predicting accidents that happen anyway. Or maybe he's creating conditions that make accidents more likely, and documenting them in advance so it looks like prediction." "How would he even do that?" Richard asked. I didn't have a good answer, but I got permission to observe Joseph anyway. What I saw during that patrol was subtle and chilling. Joseph would position himself at portage trails and observe incoming paddlers. When vulnerable-looking paddlers arrived, he'd engage them in conversation. He'd ask about their route, their experience level, whether they had proper flotation devices. He'd make casual recommendations. "That route can get windy in the afternoon," or "the portage is longer than most people expect," or "watch out for submerged logs on that section." All of the information was technically accurate, but the way he delivered it, with a tone of authority, with specific warnings that seemed to emphasize danger, appeared designed to make people nervous, less confident, more likely to make mistakes. Then he'd let them go, and he'd document them in the logbook before they even reached their destination. I confronted him directly. "Joseph," I said, catching him at a portage, "I've been reviewing the logbook entries. You've been making predictions about paddlers and their outcomes." He looked at me with an expression I can only describe as serene. "It's a hobby," he said. "I like to observe people under stress. I like to predict how they'll behave when things don't go their way." "People have died," I said. 17 people over the past 4 years, all matching scenarios you predicted." "I'm very perceptive," he said. "I read people well. I can see the vulnerable ones, and I can predict how they'll fail. That's not a crime." "But people are dying," I said. "People die," he said. "That's not news. That's not something I'm causing. That's just what happens when unprepared people venture into wilderness." "You're influencing them," I said. "You're deliberately making them nervous, less confident." "I'm giving them accurate information," he said. "What they do with that information is their choice. If they panic and make bad decisions, that's not my responsibility." I arrested him right then, or tried to. But Joseph didn't resist. He was perfectly compliant. And when I brought him to the station and explained everything to Richard and the police, the situation fell apart. Joseph hadn't actually done anything illegal. He'd given accurate information to paddlers. He'd written observations in a logbook. Neither of these things constitutes a crime. And while the coincidence between his predictions and subsequent deaths was unsettling, there was no evidence he'd intended harm or had taken deliberate action to cause those deaths. The logbook entries themselves were ambiguous. Predictable doesn't prove predation. Expected outcome doesn't prove intention. Without concrete evidence of a crime, Joseph was released. He quit his job the next day. As far as I know, he's still out there, still working seasonally at parks across the country, still observing vulnerable paddlers, still writing his predictions in logbooks. And I'm still here, monitoring incident reports, trying to connect dots that nobody in authority wants to see connected. The boundary waters are beautiful. They're also dangerous, but most of the danger isn't from the wilderness itself. It's from the people who understand how the wilderness works and who figured out that it's a perfect place to observe human vulnerability without accountability. If you ever paddle remote waters and you encounter a ranger who seems unusually interested in your vulnerabilities, in your route, in your experience level, trust that instinct. Don't let authority in uniform override your gut, because some people who work in wilderness management aren't there to protect you. They're there to observe what happens when people like you make mistakes. And they're documenting it all.